think we're good to go, right? Yeah. Is it? Can you hear me from? Yeah. Because I. Yeah. Sounds good. Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. Closer. Like this? Is that okay? I need to talk louder. Okay. Cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk, which is titled "Your Prototype Sucks. Here's Why." So there's a correct way of reading this and a wrong way. The correct way of reading this isn't your prototype sucks. I'm going to tell you why. It's more like if you think your prototype sucks, if it's not working properly, something's not like it's not being successful the way it's supposed to do. Hopefully, this talk will give you some pointers. So it's not meant to be aggressive. And so, quick presentation on who I am. Oh, sorry, who I am. My name is Isaac. I am an interaction artist. I work with digital stuff, analog stuff. I do sometimes hybrid stuff. I've worked with VR in the past. I am currently senior game designer at Ubisoft Red Links in Finland. And I'm also an independent game developer in my spare time. I do weird stuff that's not very profitable sometimes, but yeah, it's just a bit of both. So, by the way, that screen is going to be at the end of the talk. Yeah, that was my social media handle. So let's just start. And we're going to start with a meme. So that's going to be our framing device. So it's kind of a joke. I don't know if you're familiar with this meme, but the idea is that as you go deeper and deeper, you unlock more knowledge. So we start at the surface, and in the surface, we have a sentence that I've heard many, many times, different variations, that a prototype is a prototype. Or, some people think that all prototypes are equal, they're the same, they function kind of the same way. And you might have encountered, sometimes you're at a company or even, like, again, working with friends outside of working hours or something. You try to do some adjustments in your prototyping methodology, and people will say, hey, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? Like, it's not rocket science. Like, prototyping is straightforward. A prototype is a prototype, right? So that would be the surface level and a good starting point. By the way, before we go any further, we have to define what a prototype is for this talk, really. So in design, there's a lot of industries and there's a lot of sub-disciplines, and so it's kind of very complicated because there's a lot of jargon. A lot of design disciplines use the same words for different things or different words for the same thing. And for the purpose of this talk, we're going to simplify things, and we're going to define a prototype as a proof, really. A prototype is a proof of feasibility. It's something, whenever you're making something, in this case a game, you want to prove that you can make this thing, and therefore you make this small experiment. And so I'm going to be using the term prototype, but also minimum viable product, like MVP or proof of concept interchangeably, right? So going back to this sentence, some people say that there's nothing else to be said about prototyping. It's all the same thing. However, if you've been making games or really software in general for some time, you might have encountered the terms vertical and horizontal, right? You learn that in school, in university, and a lot of game companies use those terms to describe their prototypes. And so if you're not familiar with those terms, I'm going to explain that in a second. It's really, really simple. So imagine you have a line, an horizontal line, that's your fidelity, right? The level of quality, really how much your experiment looks like the final product, right? And on the vertical line, you have a scope. You have a broader scope or a more narrow or specific scope. And so really, an horizontal prototype, sometimes they're called, like for the vertical especially, people call them vertical slices. it has to do with Agile, I think, and Scrum, but I'm not going to bore you with that, but just some people, again, use different words for the same thing. An horizontal prototype is something that is very, very broad in scope, so something very general, like you try to prove as many things as possible, but low fidelity. And a vertical prototype is something, it's actually the opposite. So you try to do something, one thing, really, really well. You try to focus and have it be as high fidelity as possible. This is very abstract. Let's use examples. So this is a block mesh prototype of Uncharted 4. By the way, I've not worked in Uncharted 4 or any of the games that I'm going to be using as examples. For obvious reasons, I don't want to use real-life examples of things I've worked on. But also, in general, all of the games that I'm going to feature, like, they're good games and use those as recommendations. So, like, for example, Uncharted 4 is really good. Play it. You should play it. But yeah, so a block mesh prototype is basically something, and it's very used in the AAA industry. It's basically something that doesn't resemble at all the final product, like in terms of visuals, in terms of presentation. But in this case, for this game in particular, you could play, at some point in development, you could play from the start to the end, the whole game. Obviously, those are not trucks, right? Like, it's not exactly, it doesn't look the same way, like, it's not the same thing at all, but you could very well go from point A to point B, play the whole thing. The reverse of that, so that would be an horizontal prototype, right? Like, the reverse of that, and I'm kind of cheating here because this is not really, some people would say it's not a prototype, but I think it counts because it's still a proof of concept. This is the demo for a game that was cancelled, PT. And I think it's a good example because we actually don't know what the final game would be at all. They focused on a very, very small thing, very, very narrow, again, in scope, but it was really well presented. It had, so it's a horror game, and it has this mood, and it's a palpable atmosphere, and you can really sense what the final product would feel like, even though you have no idea what it would play like. You know that what it is, right? It's very, very small, and it's actually very scary. So again, you don't know what it would look like, but you have a really narrow sense of what it is. So I think, like, this is a very small slice of the game. Again, if you want to use vertical slice as an example. Those, I think, are good examples for that. And the reason why we're going and think, sorry, the reason why we're talking about this is to talk about the no-go zones. So if you're with me so far, let's go and talk about these two quadrants. Basically, this is also something that's kind of taught in universities. Sometimes it's implicit, but you know, if these two are good ways of prototyping, the opposite two are bad. And why? Well, it really comes down to money or resources. Time is money, right? Like, if you think about it, it's really obvious. If you make a very, very broad prototype, like the full game almost, and it's really high fidelity, it kind of costs the same thing as actually making the game. So it doesn't make a lot of sense that you would try to prove at such a scale. In the reverse, if you try to do something very narrow, that also doesn't inform you, like, of anything feeling-wise, like that doesn't look like the final product in any shape or form, yes, it's going to be cheap, but you know, like, a million times zero is still zero. So at the end, like, yes, it's going to be cheap one, you can make a lot of them, but at the very end, like, it's going to be very costly because you're not proving anything, right? So these really are what one would call the no-go zones, and you should avoid them at all costs, right? So this is the starting point. Some people think, okay, prototypes are prototypes, especially if they're not technical. When you do that pretty often, or you've done a few prototypes, you kind of have an intuition, especially from school, that, like, there's this binary, right? Like the horizontal and the vertical. Well, that's it. That was the talk. Thank you for attending. There's nothing else to say about prototype. No, joking, obviously. Some of you have experienced probably that this is not the full story, right? Like there's probably more to this than an original meets the eye. So again, probably not the full story. Let's use some examples, and I think some of these might be familiar to you. You've probably encountered yourself in these situations. Let's say that you're making this game. Again, never worked in this game. What Remains of Edith Finch. It's an amazing game. It's a wonderful, awesome experimental game about a story of a family like haunted by death. The game is always changing. The controls are always changing. Sometimes you play as a shark, sometimes you play as a cat, you play as a baby. It's very well done because as a player you're never confused, right? And so, for example, in this scene you play as a boy in a swing, and I'm not going to say more, like otherwise I would be spoiling. But if you haven't played, please do. And so, let's say you wanted to make this game. It's not done, right? Like you start from the beginning. And let's say because, it's very control-driven, the game is always changing in terms of controls and etc. You obviously, maybe, would start with an horizontal prototype, right? That makes sense, I guess. So because like you really need to prove that gameplay and those inputs and etc. So imagine you go low fidelity, big scope. You try to make as many of those scenes as possible, maybe the whole game, right? And you start like proving out gameplay, right? You make a gym with a dog and with a cat, and you try to really nail down those ideas, right? Like it needs to work, and the fidelity is something that you're going to worry later on. It just needs to feel right to play. It needs to make sense. It needs to not be confusing, right? You make the shark prototype, everything. You even make the swing, and you're good to go. The game is actually fully playable. And now you start implementing and adding art, or again, it's very, very good. Actually, let's say that at this point, you meet your publisher and you show all of this playable, and the publisher goes, wait, what is this thing? I don't get it. What's this game about? Because as I told you, yes, the gameplay is always changing everything, but the framing of the gameplay is the story. It's all about the presentation. Right, and yes, so you can have a prototype that works. It's fully functional. It's really, really well done, and it's actually fun to play. But you're presenting a proof to someone who doesn't understand your proof, because for them, the story is a big aspect of why you're even playing that game, right? Like, what is the meaning of the swing? So, okay, we have a time machine. You go back in time, and this time, you actually work in a vertical slice. Let's forget the horizontal prototypes. We just work on this one thing. It's really well done. You nail the audio, the atmosphere. You'd want everything to feel like the final product. Obviously, just a swing, right? Because there's no money to do everything. So you make this really narrow, really well-made slice of the game. And then you show it to you, and you're in a team meeting, and they're like, wait, so what kind of game is this? I have no, because again, you can play as a shark and you can play as a baby. What are we doing here? Is this a swing simulator? So even if you were to go back in time, you would kind of be always stuck in this position, right? So it's not about horizontal or vertical. It's about people trusting your prototype. And if people don't trust what you're trying to prove, you have a problem. Let's use some more examples for variety. So imagine you're making Angry Birds. So Angry Birds, again, if you haven't played, I guess we're all people who play games, so I think I'm going to drop that. But just as a reminder, it's a very physics-driven game. It has ballistics. It has actually really solid physics, and it runs on mobile devices. So all of that needs to be really, really well optimized and everything. But again, physics first, but also it's very readable, right? You look at the characters, they're also very iconic, right? You look at the characters, you recognize the characters. They're so iconic that there's a franchise, right? You can sell merchandise, there's movies, right? That's basically Angry Birds, and you wanna get to this point. So you start from the beginning, and again, right, you make an horizontal prototype, because you need to prove the physics, right? And you go to this point and you're like, yeah, this works, right? Like this is how we want to make the game. Maybe we can make like this ball here, like this sphere, maybe it's going to be a character, we'll see. You don't know, right? Like you don't know if your game can be pretty and readable, because before Angry Birds, like there were other attempts at making this kind of game. And sometimes they had mixed results, right? Like it's not obvious just because your physics work that you can achieve readability and iconic characters and a good world building, etc. So again, maybe like if you were making that prototype even for yourself, not even you can trust your prototype. So it's not them, it's you now. Final example, and I'm going to stop with examples in a second. But let's say, again, you're making Among Us. And this time, okay, I've given 2 horizontal prototype examples. Let's say that this time you do a vertical slice, and you want to focus on the mini games, and you do final art on everything. You have to cut something. So let's say you cut multiplayer, right? And instead of having 10 players or something, you only have 2, 3, let's say 4, right? Like have 4 players. It's not obviously the same thing, but you can kind of get the feeling, yeah, sure. But again, does this game scale up? Is it still fun? Even though you just, yes, it's mostly the same game, but with 4 players, you cannot guarantee that it's going to be the same experience, and that it's going to be fun when you have 10. So it's not you, it's not them. It's really about the prototype itself. Like, why would anyone trust a prototype? What's the point of making a prototype if you can trust your prototype? So, as I was saying, this is probably not the full story, right? Horizontal and vertical, there's more to it. And again, if you cannot prove that your game is going to work, there's really no point in prototyping. So, sometimes your prototypes might suck. Not because they're badly made or like because they don't make sense. Sometimes they're very well done. But sometimes it's about trust, right? Like you make a proof that the game works and people don't trust. And sometimes they don't even prove that much, right? It's supposed to be cheaper, faster, like that's the whole point of prototyping, but you go back to square one and you wasted a lot of money. Here's a list of greatest hits of doubts, right? Like you're making a game, and at some point you hear like this sentence or this sentence. So for example, you're making a small mechanic in a gym. It works, it's fun, but then how, like, do you know, like, that what's the cost the impact is gonna have in the full production? You know, like is this scalable really? You're making a demo and the AI is dumb, and you're like, yeah, the AI is gonna be good later on, but you know that it's actually be good enough. It's going to be good enough, or that whatever AI is going to be in the final product matches your intent. So yeah. So again, horizontal and vertical is probably not enough. What can we do? For the rest of this talk, I am going to pitch you a set of 3 ideas. They're very simple, but very simple ideas that I think can help you mitigate these situations, but also improve your prototypes. At least I hope so. So it's the who, the how, and the what. I'll explain in a second. What is your hypothesis? How cheap is your proof? Who is your audience? Let's go into the first one. What is your hypothesis? In other words, what are you trying to prove? And in other words, prototypes are for testing ideas. This seems very obvious, but follow me through this. Let's say that you're using the scientific method, because like science is also about proving things. Your prototype, if you were using this, your prototype would live here in the conduct experiment phase. That means that the formulate question and the generate hypothesis had to already have happened, right? if you don't know what you're testing, it's kind of doesn't make a lot of sense that you're trying to conduct an experiment. Because like, it could be that you don't know what you're looking for and you're just prototyping to actually, I don't know, get some ideas, generating an idea. Prototypes are obviously not optimal for that. So again, imagine you're making Valorant. And we go back to the block mesh prototype. So hypothetical prototype for Valorant. What kind of questions does this block mesh are appropriate for this block mesh to answer? Let's say, does this player speed feel good? Right? You have an hypothesis, right? Like that. Sorry, you have a question, and now you have an hypothesis. So you have a question: does it feel good? And you have an hypothesis: yes or no, right? Like, it probably feels good. Let's test. That works, right? Like that's scientific. Is this enemy range okay? Again, you have a specific question. You can add a nav mesh to the blockout, and yeah, you can put some enemies and see what kind of enemies you can generate. Or I don't know, like, are the NPCs pathfinding correctly? You know, that's all appropriate questions. However, at this stage, if you don't know what the core loop of the game is, you know, what's the core loop of the game is not an appropriate question, because you're not testing anything, right? This would be a huge waste of resources. You're not trying to prove any idea. You're actually fishing for ideas, right? You're prototyping as a means of inspiration, and prototypes are awful tools for that. In fact, there's cheaper ways of getting inspired, and this could be another talk about that, but yeah, I mean, they're not optimal for that. So what is your hypothesis is, I think, like a really strong question that a lot of people, for some reason, kind of forget. And speaking of cheap, how cheap is your proof? So imagine that you're measuring the diameter of the planet Earth. Forget about games for a second and just follow me through this rabbit hole. You're tasked with this, and how would you do that? There's one way, that's kind of a silly way. You could shoot a rocket into space and have it take a bunch of pictures, and those pictures could be sent via internet to a server, and an AI could merge the pictures, and you'd get an idea of the scale of the surface of the planet, and you can calculate the diameter. Obviously, physics are not like this, right? Like, no physicist has ever done this. But this would be an hypothetical way of doing it. However, you'd be surprised to know that someone, before even physics were invented, or the internet, or anything like that, this person calculated the diameter of the Earth. And how did that happen? It's very simple. Simply put, in a nutshell, he looked at shadows and did some math. So, not going to, again, bore you with the explanation, but basically, he measured shadows in two different places with the same object. And with the difference in shadows, there's a simple equation, reverse engineered the diameter of the Earth. So why am I talking about this? This is not a physics talk. It's simple. Tip number 2, whenever you can, use a stick instead of a spaceship, right? To go back to the Among Us example, yes, you only have 4 players. Sure, you don't know the dynamics between players if they're like 10, a group of 10. But nothing's preventing you from just doing a paper prototype, right? You could still do pretty much the same dynamics. You don't need a server for that, right? So basically, like the reason why a stick is smarter than a spaceship is because a stick is cheaper than a spaceship. So really, when we say how cheap is your proof, what we're saying really is how smart is your proof. And yeah, so let's go to the final one. Who is your audience? And I think this one might be maybe the most controversial of them all. But again, we're gonna go for something completely different that is not related to games. I love detective fiction and I hate detective fiction, so this supposedly is Watson and Sherlock. I don't know if you've ever read a Conan Doyle book, but it's very goofy. It usually goes like this. Sherlock will explain how he made a huge deduction about, the killer was left-handed because I saw like there was scratch marks on the cane, and like there's a cigar that's only sold on Sundays, and there's gunpowder from like it's usually a huge monologue of non sequiturs whenever like something is a theory for a crime is being explained. And Watson could never imagine such a thing, just accepts it willingly. It's just, yeah, of course. And in real life, to me, that makes no sense, right? Like, that's not, because Watson does not understand if Watson does not understand the proof, why would Watson, or the police really, like, agree with Sherlock, right? In real life, Watson would just say, what? Because, like, they would be freaked out. All the time, right? Because that's not how persuasion works, right? Like different people see the world differently, which is the third tip. Different people see the world differently, and I think this is kind of obvious, right? But again, let's center back to video games. So your publisher asks you, let's say your publisher is Watson. Publisher asks you, hey, but how do you know the game is going to be fun? And you go, it's elementary, dear publisher. Here's a bunch of spheres, and you show them this, like whatever. Like it's kind of for you, it makes a lot of sense, right? It's like your team believes in it, like it makes total sense. Like this proves the project works, right? Like it's like good tech, and it's fun and it's intuitive. But the publisher doesn't understand what they're looking at. It's just a bunch of red spheres, and they don't get it. So the trick here is really empathy, right? It's asking yourself, who is this person that I'm talking to, and should I make what kind of prototype speaks to them, right? Really, who are you trying to prove this to, and what's their stake in it, in a way, right? Is this a client, an investor, player base? Like, are you making this for your team? Like, who really is supposed? Like, because the proof is different for different people. Are you even trying to prove this to yourself, that this is a good time investment for you? But more importantly, what are they looking for, right? Because a prototype can provide proofs in different levels, right? Are you proving a vision? Are you proving art? Because again, this is a mismatch, right? Like your publisher probably doesn't care about the tech, or maybe they care, but like clearly if they're confused, maybe they were looking for a narrative or something, right? Is it marketing, design? Like it's basically, is it fun, right? Like sometimes a lot of you can have an art Bible, you can have a bunch of things. Like everything like but it's not fun, and your publisher or any other stakeholder might think that it's a very inappropriate prototype for them. What kind of emotional language do they speak is really, and what kind of domain of expertise they're into. Because like, just to wrap this up, some people need to see this, others need this, right? Others need this, etc. So that's really the last point. Who is your audience? And hopefully, with these three, you can, I guess, avoid awkward situation when you're presenting your prototype. Obviously, there's more, right? Like this is not. I don't think this is the final answer to prototyping. And actually, I thought about including a few more slides, but what I really want to do is to create a dialogue. And so basically, I'm just going to wrap up the talk. But to go back just for 1 second, really what I want to discuss this with people because everything here is very theoretical, and in practice, I'd love to get feedback from people who have had frustrations prototyping, and I don't know, in a year seeing like if for example these three sets of ideas, like if this set of three ideas, sorry, if that works. But yeah, that's basically it. So I don't know what's at the bottom. I'd love your help to figure that out. So that was it. And yeah, if you like this talk, follow me on, not on Twitter. I moved from Twitter to Threads, kind of a weird space now. But this is my social media handle. And yeah, that was it really. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Burning questions on my way.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question about fun, specifically in the case of when you make games that are not supposed to be fun, like how to approach that, because some games are there to just challenge us, and that's the type of games we make, and they're not to be fun, you know, they're meant to be morally, you know, questioning and pushing people and confronting people with their own value systems and beliefs. And when people, are, you know, investors and publishers are seeking products, they're looking for that. All right, is this engaging? Is this fun? So yeah, fun is like a very open word. How would you tackle games that are more challenging instead of, you know, quote unquote fun, and depends on your term? Yeah.
Thank you. So if I understood correctly, your question, it's how would one make a prototype that's not centered around fun and present that to someone who's looking for fun, basically. I think if there's a mismatch, and I agree with you that fun is kind of a very broad word that at this point doesn't mean anything. Because one would argue, for example, that you gave the example of a morally ambiguous scenario, or like more narrative or challenging your inner, you know, values or something like that. That some people would call that fun. I don't know. But again, if you, and I think this is basically most of what the talk was about this. If you have something that someone doesn't want to look at, or they don't understand, or that's not really their vibe, there's a mismatch. I think there's nothing to do, really. It's just finding the right people to talk to, or changing whatever you're selling to them, basically.
Any more questions or topics you want to bring up? More?
Yeah, my question is in terms of prototypes towards like that is heavily based on stories, like you showed in the first one with the slide. I wanted to ask in those terms, when it comes to prototypes, how would the who, how, and what question exactly applies? Because I didn't understand it quite well how it could be work for story-driven games that are with less gameplay. So yeah, how would that work?
Yeah. So your question was how would the three, like the who, the what, the how, and the who, would work in a more narrative-oriented game, right? So as an example, if for example, just with the who, right? If you're trying to convince someone, yourself, let's even say, that your game is a solid game, and you're doing a prototype, solid game narrative, like in terms of narrative, in terms of, you know, presentation, world building, and it doesn't include any of that, right? That would be kind of like a mismatch of the who, right? Like, so you would obviously want to, if you're interested in seeing a world, right, you would want to include that. If you're interested in character development, you'd want some aspect of that proved in your proof of concept. As to, for example, the how, or how cheap, I've seen a lot of people waste, I'm guilty of that, waste a lot of money searching, because to some extent, concept art, for example, also has, like, it fits into that binary of vertical and horizontal. You can do like very broad concept art that's not very detailed, and you can do very specific. So in a way, concept art is kind of a prototype as well. I've seen a lot of people just trying to find something wasting a lot of money, just doing a lot of pre-production, because they, you know, maybe there's a cheaper way of achieving that, right? Like maybe if there's a cheaper way, you should take it, basically. And yeah, as to the what, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, yeah. For example, so if you just given the example of the cheapness, let's say that I've been guilty of that. So for example, again with the concept art, you go, I want to see cars. Okay, what kind of cars? I'll just make a bunch of them and we'll see, right? Or let's just, if you don't know, again, what you're looking for, if you have no hypothesis really, it's going to be very hard to want to keep your team motivated, because people kind of hate doing that, but also like, what are you doing? You know, like it's just, I've seen a lot of, so for example, a lot of the times you especially with the what, you will have a world and you're trying to find gameplay. And instead of you know, doing some like a good list of things that would fit your game, you just kind of go and blue sky prototype, and you do one, you do the other, and things that, like, from the very beginning you kind of know that they would never fit your story, but you just kind of do them anyway because it's fun, or because you're trying to find some idea. You're just trying to get that lightning in the bolt. I think like if you consider those three at any stage, even for a narrative game, you kind of think it's kind of useful, I'd say. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I just have a question about, I have the impression that we explored, you tried to answer the question from the developer standpoint, is to understand what I really want, having a hypothesis and asking the right questions. But my question is, if you put yourself in the publisher's shoes, what are actually usually the publisher are looking for? I know, let's suppose like the developer knows exactly what they want to provide with the game. They have a very solid idea about the gameplay system, the story, if it's a narrative game, and so on. But from a publisher standpoint, what are the things that you think that are more important that the publisher actually look for to validate if this is actually a good prototype or not? Is it like a bit of everything? Like, is it like a bit of the vertical slice, a bit of the game mechanics, a bit of the art, or there is a specific point that the publisher is giving more attention to say, hey, this is a potentially good game that I can acquire and help develop?
Thank you for your question. So your question is, if I understood correctly, what kind of prototypes are publishers looking for, basically, right? I don't know. One, I've never worked as a publisher, and so I have an intuition and an idea of what they're looking. Also, like, it really depends on the publisher. But I would say, completely intuitive answer, I have no idea actually, but I would say that horizontal prototypes usually do better internally, and vertical ones do better for external people. And that's true for a publisher, but that's also true for a client, for example. Right, so like, let's say you show an engine, you know, under the hood, everything to a client. They're like, I don't know what I asked for. This was I don't know, a McDonald's commercial, right? Like something like that. So to them, they don't, and it also has to do with the fact that when you're a game developer, you're probably a bit more technically minded, right? And so something that is not complete within a team is way more obvious to someone who doesn't make games, right? So I'd say that, but again, I don't know. I'd say that there's a tendency for the vertical prototypes to do way better for non-game developers. However, this is not always true. I have 1,000 counterexamples in my head, so it's kind of a generalization, I'd say. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
So let's say, hypothetically, we're on a team and we made a prototype and it kind of proves the fun, but something is just not right about it. And we want to do an iteration in order to make it just right. What would you, as a game designer, suggest to do in order to iterate it in a way so it maybe becomes just right in the end? Because it's sort of fun, but it's not exactly what it could be already.
So your question is, we have something that's working, hypothetically. Imagine we're working together, and it's not quite there. It needs just a little bit of a push, a change. How is the correct way of iterating in a prototype, right? I don't know, but I know a lot of wrong ways of doing that. So cowboy coding, blue sky, so brainstorming really with code is not I've seen people, I'm also guilty of this, maybe we go back to square one, whatever. I know this is a game set in space, but maybe it could be a pirate game. I don't know, and you keep on pivoting. That really, I think it speaks to the idea of what kind of hypothesis are you testing, because if you're just doing random stuff, that's kind of the infinite monkey theory. That infinite monkeys in typewriters would eventually write like a Shakespeare play. Yes, but infinite monkeys is a lot of monkeys, right? And yes, if you kind of brute force your way into ideas, you can do that. If you're a trillionaire, right? In reality, you cannot just do random stuff and hope to come across something that's interesting. So really what you should look at is, okay, why is this not working? Not that you need to somehow understand, but just theorize, right? Why is this not working? Oh, maybe it likes this. Let's test it then. You add this. Okay, maybe it's too fast. You change the speed. Maybe, and if you have a maybe, an idea of what you're looking for, I think this is way more constructive than just shooting randomly in the dark. And I've been guilty of doing this, but I see a lot of people doing this. And sometimes, I think it's, again, I cannot stress enough that even for you, your faith, even if you're a solo dev, your faith in the project might suffer because of that. But when you're in a team, and you've been more than a few months, or you've been years doing something, and you actually are aimless, that's really demotivating. So it's not even the product that suffers, it might even be the whole project as a team. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I have a question about the who part of the prototyping. Because I understand that sometimes you're prototyping to, prove a concept to the publisher. But how would you bridge the gap where you do realize as a designer that the publisher is not the type of player that your core audience would be for that, game? For example, if I'm working on a casual game and my publisher is sort of like a mid-core gamer, they probably wouldn't find it as fun. And I don't want to end up in an endless loop of just keep prototyping to make the publisher happy. So what would you think is an effective way to overcome that?
It's a very good question. So I'm going to try to reiterate it in my own words. You've asked basically, when your audience and your investor, publisher are not aligned in terms of interests, how do you make a prototype that speaks to both? Well, I don't think you can, really. And maybe you have to do, because that's the thing, if you're smart about it, prototypes can be cheap, right? So if you cut down in the right places, maybe your prototype could be 2 prototypes. And maybe what prototype that proves to whoever is funding the game that it works might not be the same prototype that you're actually testing with your audience. I had some examples of that in this talk, but because I think, again, I really want to create a discourse around this and have people talk to me about like their notions. But one of the slides that I cut was that, you know, in design thinking, some people, like in industrial design or even like general software development, some like paper prototypes are not necessarily board games. They sometimes are just storyboards, right? Or videos even. And so nothing, like a mood video, technically, is a type of prototype. It's kind of the same thing that I was saying about concept art, right? So maybe for your publisher, just show them a video of what the gameplay would be like. You know, like that's cheap. And maybe they're happy with it. So, and you don't have to win both battles in one go. You can just win 2 separate battles. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
Last one.
So if you're building maybe a mid-sized game that has multiple disparate systems, like combat systems and exploration and maybe a leveling system, you know, character progression and skill acquisition, would you make several modules for a prototype, or would you be terribly concerned with making one unified prototype that has all of the systems in one, you know, 10, 15-minute chunk?
Yeah. So, how does one make a good prototype when it's a large-scale game and there's so many systems and so much stuff, right?
It's almost like that
Yeah.
that Finch example that you brought up. That I'm not sure how we show all of those systems in one unified prototype well.
Yeah. I mean, you can't, I think. Like, that's, like, again, if you try to do everything and you try to do it in a really high quality, right? Like, that's, like, if you can try to do everything really low fidelity, but high fidelity is going to cost you as much as the game. So it's not like the block mesh thing that I showed for Uncharted. It's actually not, it's not uncommon at all in AAA games, right? Because they're very big, and you need to prove a lot of things in one go. And doing individual gyms for mechanics or like small levels that are not interconnected can only get you so far, right? Because even for pacing the whole thing, right? Like you kind of need to see a broad strokes vision of the game at some point. But that doesn't also, I think this doesn't, like, AAA games also have gyms, right? So in a way, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. Basically, if you're doing things correctly, you would prototype a lot, and you'd prototype in a lot of ways, right? As long as the prototypes are not as expensive as the game, and as long as you can cut down corners, yeah, like, I mean, you'd want to do that. However, I do understand your question that it's always a leap of faith, right? Because there's always going to be something that's missing, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't be a prototype. That's kind of the same thing as, you know, if you're an architect, you do a scale model, and it looks exactly like that, but at its actual scale, does it feel the same way, right? Like it looks exactly like that, but in reality, you're not a giant looking over, you know, like, obviously once it's done, it will feel completely different. Hopefully, you can choose where those blind spots will be, and you can focus on the things that matter, right? So that would be where your hypothesis would be key, really. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you all for your questions. Our speaker will be available outside this hall to answer any more of your questions or have a quick discussion. Thank you for your talk. It was really cool.